In the autumn of 1918, as the guns of the First World War were finally beginning to fall silent, another catastrophe was reaching its peak. Across continents, hospitals overflowed, entire households fell ill within days, and cities struggled to bury their dead. In a matter of months, an invisible pathogen moved with a speed and reach unprecedented in recorded history. By the time it subsided, an estimated 50 million people worldwide had died. The influenza pandemic of 1918 did not merely accompany the end of a global war, it reshaped societies, exposed weaknesses in public health systems, and altered the course of the 20th century. The origins of the pandemic remain the subject of historical and scientific investigation. Many scholars identify early cases in the United States in the spring of 1918, particularly at Camp Funston in Kansas, where soldiers reported influenza-like symptoms in March of that year. Others have proposed possible earlier outbreaks in Europe or Asia. While absolute certainty is elusive, what is clear is that the movement of troops during the First World War created ideal conditions for the rapid transmission of respiratory disease. Crowded barracks, troopships, and trenches facilitated the spread of infection across national borders. The first wave of illness in early 1918 appeared relatively mild. Influenza was a familiar seasonal disease, and initial outbreaks did not immediately suggest an impending global crisis. However, even this early phase demonstrated the efficiency of wartime transportation networks in dispersing infection. American soldiers carried the virus to Europe, where it circulated among Allied and Central powers alike. From military camps, it moved into civilian populations. Ports, railways, and industrial centers became nodes in a rapidly expanding web of contagion. The second wave, emerging in late summer and early autumn of 1918, proved far more lethal. By August, outbreaks were reported in port cities such as Brest in France, Freetown in Sierra Leone, and Boston in the United States. Within weeks, infection rates soared. Unlike typical seasonal influenza, which tends to affect the very young and the elderly most severely, the 1918 strain caused unusually high mortality among healthy young adults. Medical researchers later identified the responsible virus as an H1N1 influenza A subtype, reconstructed decades afterward from preserved tissue samples. The precise biological mechanisms that led to the high mortality remain under study, but many scientists believe that an intense immune response in young adults contributed to severe complications. Secondary bacterial pneumonia, in an era before antibiotics, was a common cause of death. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, viruses had not yet been directly visualized, and many physicians initially suspected bacterial causes. Public health measures relied on isolation, quarantine, and basic hygiene recommendations, often implemented inconsistently. The pandemic scale became evident by September 1918. In the United States, cities such as Philadelphia experienced explosive outbreaks following large public gatherings. A Liberty Loan parade held on September 28 proceeded despite warnings from some medical officials. Within days, hospitals were overwhelmed. In contrast, cities like St. Louis, which implemented school closures and restrictions on public gatherings earlier, recorded lower peak mortality rates. These differences later became case studies in the effectiveness of non-pharmaceutical interventions. Across Europe, wartime censorship shaped public awareness. Governments feared that reports of widespread illness might weaken morale. Spain, neutral during the war and lacking similar censorship, reported openly on the outbreak when King Alfonso XIII fell ill. As a result, the disease became widely known as the Spanish flu, although Spain was not the origin. The label reflected patterns of reporting rather than epidemiological evidence. In Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the pandemic's impact was profound, though documentation varies by region. In India, then under British colonial rule, mortality may have exceeded 12 million people. Overcrowded cities, food shortages linked to wartime disruptions, and limited medical infrastructure contributed to high fatality rates. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, labor migration and military recruitment facilitated transmission. In the Pacific Islands, isolated communities experienced devastating losses when ships introduced the virus. Western Samoa, for example, lost a significant proportion of its population within weeks of the disease's arrival. By October 1918, many major cities worldwide faced acute crises. Schools, theaters, and places of worship closed in numerous jurisdictions. Mask ordinances were enacted in cities including San Francisco. Public compliance varied, and enforcement was uneven. Volunteer nurses, including members of the Red Cross, worked to provide care amid severe staffing shortages. With many physicians and medical personnel serving in the war, civilian healthcare systems were strained. The pandemic also intersected with the closing phase of the First World War. Military operations were affected as soldiers on both sides fell ill in large numbers. Some historians argue that the disease weakened German forces during critical moments of the conflict in 1918, though it is difficult to measure the precise strategic impact. The armistice of November 11, 1918, ended the fighting in Europe, but mass gatherings celebrating the ceasefire may have facilitated further transmission in some regions. A third wave followed in early 1919, less widespread than the second but still significant. By this time, public health authorities had more experience in implementing control measures, though fatigue and economic pressures complicated sustained restrictions. The pandemic gradually receded over the course of 1919 and into 1920, as population immunity increased and the virus mutated into less virulent forms. The social impact of the pandemic was extensive. Families lost primary wage earners, leaving widows and orphans in precarious economic situations. In many communities, the sudden loss of teachers, clergy, and local officials disrupted social cohesion. Funeral services were often curtailed due to gathering restrictions, altering traditional mourning practices. In some regions, public trust in institutions was shaken, particularly where authorities had downplayed risks or failed to respond promptly. Economically, the pandemic compounded wartime disruptions. Factories closed temporarily due to worker absenteeism. Agricultural production declined in some areas when laborers fell ill during harvest seasons. However, the pandemic's economic effects were uneven and, in some industrialized countries, relatively short-lived compared to the prolonged economic consequences of the war itself. Nonetheless, the experience highlighted the vulnerability of interconnected economies to public health crises. Politically, the pandemic influenced governance and public health policy. The limitations of existing health infrastructures became evident. In the United States, the crisis underscored the fragmented nature of public health authority, divided among local, state, and federal bodies. In many countries, the pandemic contributed to subsequent investments in national health systems and epidemiological research. Internationally, the experience informed the creation of health organizations within the framework of the League of Nations, which sought to coordinate responses to transnational health threats. Scientific understanding of influenza advanced significantly in the decades that followed. In 1933, British researchers successfully isolated the influenza A virus, confirming its viral nature. Later laboratory work identified the 1918 strain as H1N1. Genetic analysis conducted in the late 20th century provided insight into its avian origins, suggesting that the virus likely emerged from reassortment events involving animal and human influenza viruses. Such findings deepened scientific appreciation of zoonotic disease risks. The memory of the 1918 pandemic faded in many public narratives, overshadowed by the scale and political consequences of the First World War. Yet its demographic impact was extraordinary. Estimates of total mortality range from 20 million to 100 million, with many scholars converging around a figure of approximately 50 million. This made it one of the deadliest events in modern history, surpassing the war that preceded it in loss of life. The age distribution of deaths had lasting demographic effects. In countries with reliable vital statistics, a noticeable dip appears in population cohorts born or raised during the pandemic years. Some researchers have examined potential long-term health impacts on those exposed in utero, suggesting associations with later life outcomes, though interpretations remain subject to ongoing scholarly debate. Culturally, the pandemic left subtle traces. Literature and personal correspondence from the period reflect the pervasive presence of illness and loss. However, unlike wars or revolutions, the pandemic did not produce a singular political narrative or memorial architecture. Its victims were dispersed across communities, and its cause lacked the identifiable human agency that often shapes collective remembrance. Public health practice evolved in response. The importance of surveillance, transparent communication, and coordinated intervention became clearer. Later influenza outbreaks, including the